My name is Rowan Vance, and for 11 years I authenticated furniture that other people took the credit for. I was good at it. That turned out to be the dangerous part. The morning the accreditation board read my name aloud, I was standing in a room with 19 other people and not one of them looked at me. They said I had signed a certificate of authenticity for a piece that was not what the certificate claimed. They said the buyer had paid $400,000 for a copy. I had not signed it. I had written, in my own hand 11 days earlier, that the attribution could not be supported. Nobody in that room had read that letter. My brother Sutton sat in the second row in a suit that cost more than my month, and when the chair asked him whether he had relied on my judgment, he said yes. He said it kindly. That is the thing people never believe afterward. He said it the way you would confirm the weather. To understand how a sentence like that ends a career, you have to understand the house it was spoken in. Vance and Daughters was founded by my grandmother Imelda in a rented garage with 2 chisels and a borrowed van. She is 81. She still comes in on Tuesdays. The firm restored and authenticated heritage furniture. Cabinets, bureaus, long case clocks. Objects that had outlived everyone who had ever owned them. My work happened at the back under a bench lamp with a loop and a scalpel and a notebook. Sutton's work happened at the front with clients. Both are real work. I want to be fair about that. He could make a nervous buyer feel clever. I could tell you which decade a screw was cut in. The trouble was never that he sold. The trouble was that the certificates went out under the firm's name, and the firm's name had come to mean my hands. I learned the trade from my grandmother directly. She taught me that an object tells the truth if you are patient, and it tells it in the joinery, not the polish. She used to say a faker paints the front and forgets the back. I have made a living on the backs of things. By 26 I was the firm's named authenticator on record with the National Board. My accreditation number was printed on every certificate we issued. That number was the whole of my professional standing. Took 9 years to earn and 1 afternoon to lose. Sutton is 6 years older. He came into the firm after 2 ventures that did not survive contact with a spreadsheet, and my grandmother gave him the front of house. I do not think he arrived intending to do what he did. I have thought about this for a long time, and that is still my honest answer. What he arrived with was a habit of saying yes before checking, and a talent for making the checking somebody else's problem. For years that habit cost us small things. A delivery date, a restoration budget. Then it cost us the Ashfield Bureau. The Bureau came to us in February, consigned by an estate in the north. Walnut, fall front, brass mounts, and a maker's attribution that would triple its value if it held. The attribution was to Cosimo Prevet, a cabinet maker who worked for perhaps 11 years in the 1780s and whose documented pieces number under 40. Sutton read the consignment note and did what he always did with good news. He told a client before he told me. The client was Beatrix Lorne. She collects with a seriousness that most institutions cannot afford anymore, and she does not enjoy being handled. She had waited 4 years for a Prevet. Sutton told her we had one. He said it in the present tense before a single joint had been examined. I got the bureau on my bench on a Thursday. By the following Monday I knew the attribution was wrong. Prevet cut his dovetails at a consistent angle and he numbered his drawer backs in a particular script. This bureau's dovetails were close. The numbering was not his. The carcass was period. The timber was right for the decade. Somebody had taken a genuine 18th century bureau and improved its parentage. That is the most common forgery in my trade and the hardest to prove. You are not arguing about a fake object. You are arguing about a fake father. I wrote it up properly. 4 pages, photographs, the numbering comparison, and a recommendation that we decline to certify and disclose the doubt to the consigner. I put it on Sutton's desk on the 18th. I emailed it as well because I had learned by then to do both. He came to my bench that evening and asked me how certain I was. I said certain enough to put my number on the doubt but not on the attribution. He said Beatrix Lorne had already arranged the transport. He said the estate needed the sale. He said a maybe would kill it and a maybe was not the same as a no. I told him a maybe was exactly the same as a no in writing with a number attached. He nodded and thanked me and left. I believed the matter was closed. That is the sentence I have replayed most often since. The sale completed on the 2nd of March. For $106,000, including our commission. I found out from the account's summary. Attached to the sale file was a certificate of authenticity attributing the bureau to Cosimo Prevet, dated the 22nd of February, carrying my accreditation number and my signature. I had not written it. I had not seen it. The signature was mine in every respect except that my hand had never been near it. I want to be precise about what I felt because people expect one thing and it was another. It was not anger. It was the sensation of a floor being quietly removed. I went to Sutton first. Not to the board, not to my grandmother. To him. I still think that was the correct order and it was certainly the least effective one. He looked at the certificate for a long moment and then he said that the paperwork had been generated from the file and that these things were partly automated now. I asked who had signed it. He said the signature block pulled from the template. I asked who had approved the attribution. He said the file had been marked ready. Every answer was in the passive voice. Nothing had been done by anyone. The certificate had simply occurred. Then he told me the most useful lie I have ever been told, which was that we should fix it quietly and that going to the board would end both of us. I agreed to give him a week. In that week he did not fix it. In that week he prepared. I have been asked what I thought fixing it quietly would look like. I thought it meant a letter to the buyer, a corrected certificate, a returned commission and an unpleasant month. That is what it would have cost in February. I have done the arithmetic since and the honest figure is about £9,000 and one apology. What it actually meant was that my brother spent 7 days building the version of events that a panel would later find easier to believe than mine. He did not do it viciously. He did it the way a man tidies a room before an inspection, moving things that look wrong out of the line of sight. On the Tuesday, he telephoned the consignor's solicitor and had the sale note amended, so that the wording changed from attributed to Cosimo Prevet to sold as catalogued. 2 words. It meant that if the attribution collapsed, the estate had said less than it appeared to have said. On the Wednesday, my 4-page report was moved. It had been in the Ashfield sale file where a report belongs. It was refiled under general research, which is where we keep articles and auction catalogs and things nobody will ever look for again. I did not know that at the time. I was at my bench with a long case clock from a school in Selby that had not run since the 1960s, and I was happy, which I mention because it is the last time in this account that I am. On the Thursday, he spoke to 2 members of staff about how much I was carrying. He asked whether they thought I seemed tired. He did not tell them anything. He asked them a question, and a question plants better than a statement because the person who answers it believes the idea was theirs. By the Friday, there were 3 people in that building who would later say, honestly and without any intention of harming me, that I had been under strain. All 3 of them were right. I had been under strain since the 18th of February, for reasons they had not been told. He asked me himself on the Thursday evening whether I had been sleeping. He asked it standing in the doorway with his coat over his arm, in exactly the tone our grandmother uses. I said I was fine. He said good and that he was handling it. I have thought since about how much of that week was calculated and how much was a man following his instincts downhill. I do not think he sat and planned it. I think every single step was the easiest available step, and that is how most people end up somewhere they would never have chosen to go. The cleverest thing he did that week took him 4 minutes. He emailed our insurers to notify them of a possible attribution query on a recent sale, and he named the authenticator of record, which was me because on paper it was. That email meant my name entered the insurer's file first, in his handwriting, in a document that predated every complaint. When a loss adjuster opened that file 8 months later, the first fact he learned about the matter was that Rowan Vance had authenticated the piece. On the Wednesday, I asked him what he had actually done. He said he had opened a dialogue. I asked with whom. He said with the relevant parties. I have since learned that when a sentence has no subject in it twice in a row, the subject is the thing being hidden. On the Friday, I asked to see the correspondence. He said most of it had been verbal. I asked him to write me a summary of what had been said and to whom. He said he would do it over the weekend. He did not do it over the weekend. So on the Saturday I went in. The building is unlocked at weekends because the finishing room runs a dehumidifier and somebody has to check it. I let myself in at about 9 and went to the Ashfield file, and the file had been printed out and rebound. It was a beautiful file, cleaner than any file I had ever assembled. Consignment note, condition report, photographs, sale note, certificate, correspondence, commission breakdown, complete, ordered and indexed, and my 4 pages were not in it. I stood in that office for a while with the file open. Then I did the only intelligent thing I did during that entire month, which was that I went to my own desk and logged in and checked whether my email of the 18th was still on the server. It was. He had removed the paper and left the system alone. I do not think it was mercy. I think he genuinely did not consider the server to be part of the file, because to him a file was a physical object that lived in a drawer and could be tidied. That email is the reason there is a story to tell rather than a shorter and sadder one. It did not save my accreditation. It was not enough on its own, and I will explain why later, because the reason is the entire point of what happened to me afterwards. I should have gone to my grandmother that Saturday. I have had 4 years to construct a defense of why I did not, and none of them survive contact with the question. I could have driven 20 minutes and knocked on her door and put the file on her table. I did not because I wanted him to fix it, not for his sake, because if he fixed it, then the version of my brother I had been carrying around since I was 9 years old would still be the correct one, and I would not have to put it down. Loyalty is not a feeling. It is a mechanism, and what it does is postpone. Every day I gave him was a day I did not have to know something, and I paid for those days at a rate I could not have imagined on the Saturday morning I bought them. The week I had given him ended on the Sunday. Nothing had been corrected, nothing had been disclosed, and the file in the drawer was tidier than it had ever been. I went back to my bench on the Monday and told myself that these things take longer than a week. On the 9th of March, Beatrix Lorne's own consultant examined the bureau and reached, in slightly better English, the same conclusion I had reached in February. She did not shout. She wrote to the board, to the estate, and to my grandmother in that order, and she attached the certificate with my number on it. The complaint reached us on a Wednesday. My grandmother read it standing up, in the middle of the showroom, without her glasses on, twice. Then she asked one question, which was whether the signature was mine. I said no. She asked Sutton the same question, and he said he had relied on my assessment. Both of those statements cannot be true. She had to choose which of her grandsons was lying on the spot, in a room with employees in it. She chose the one who had been standing at the front of the house for 6 years telling her that things were going well. I do not blame her for that as much as people assume I should. She was choosing between evidence she could not read and a face she saw every morning. The board hearing was set for the 28th. I was suspended pending it. I handed back my keys to a receptionist I had trained. My tools came to me 4 days later in a box that had held reams of printer paper, packed by somebody who did not know what any of them were. 2 gouges had been put in edge down against a steel square. I had ground and honed those edges over 11 years. A 1/4-inch mortise chisel that belonged to my great-grandfather did not arrive and has not arrived since. I have stopped asking. It is a small thing, and I have noticed that small things are what people actually carry. I had 3 weeks before the hearing. I spent the first of them reading the board's procedure rules, which are 41 pages and which almost nobody in my trade has read, including several people who sit on panels. The rules taught me the thing I most needed to know and least wanted to. The board does not decide what happened. It decides what is more likely than not to have happened, which is a much lower bar and a much stranger one. On that standard, a certificate carrying my number and my signature is evidence that I signed it. My saying otherwise is not evidence of anything. It is the position of an interested party, which is the politest thing a panel can call you before it stops listening. I paid a solicitor £180 for 1 hour. She was entirely honest with me, which at the time I resented and now consider the best value I have ever received for money. She said, "You do not need a better argument. You need one piece of paper written by somebody with nothing to gain." I asked the firm for a copy of my sent email from the server. The request went to Sutton because everything went to Sutton, and he replied that company correspondence could not be released to a suspended employee during an active regulatory matter. He was correct. That is what made it effective. I had a printout. A printout of an email proves that a document exists on your own printer. It does not prove that it was sent, or when, or to whom, and the board said so in one sentence without any apparent pleasure. I telephoned 2 people I had worked beside for 9 years. The first did not answer and has never mentioned it since, and we are, in the strange way of these things, still friendly. The second met me in a supermarket car park because he did not want to be seen in the town. He said he believed me. He said he had 2 children and 11 years on a mortgage, and that if he made a statement he would be looking for work in a trade with about 9 employers in this county. I told him he was right and that he should not make a statement. I meant it. People describe that sort of thing as cowardice when they have never had to price it, and it has a price, and he knew what his was to the pound. My grandmother did not telephone me during those 3 weeks. I have never held that against her either, although I noticed it every single day, which I suppose is a way of holding something against someone while denying that you are. Sutton telephoned twice. Both times he offered to speak on my behalf at the hearing. Both times he was warm and specific, and he used the word family. I declined. He spoke anyway, and what he said was not a lie, and that is the part that took me 2 years to understand. He never said I forged anything. He said he had relied on my judgment. He said the front of the house does not second-guess the workshop. Every sentence he gave that panel was defensible in isolation, and together they built a room with only 1 door in it. The night before, I laid everything I had on the floor of my flat and walked around it. Report, email printout, photographs of the drawer backs, the comparison table, 9 years of notebooks, 200 pages of a man being right. At about 2 in the morning I understood what I was looking at. Every single item on that floor proved what I had believed. Not one of them proved what had happened, or that the certificate had been produced by any particular person, and that was the only question the board was going to ask. Belief is not a fact about the world. It is a fact about the person holding it. I put it all in a bag anyway and went, because the alternative was not going. The hearing lasted 90 minutes. My report was entered as evidence that I had identified a concern and then, in the board's language, failed to escalate it adequately. Sutton was not accused of anything, because nobody had accused him. He was a witness. Witnesses are asked helpful questions. Ines Barros chaired the panel. She asked me twice whether I could demonstrate that I had not signed the document. I could not. You cannot prove a negative with a notebook. They withdrew my accreditation for 4 years. The firm was fined and permitted to continue trading under a supervision order. I walked out of the building at 4:30 in the afternoon and stood on the pavement for some minutes, because I did not know which direction was now correct. For 6 weeks I did very little. I am not going to dress that up. I answered 2 emails and slept badly and read about cabinet makers who had also been ruined by paperwork. The craft was the part one missed, not the standing. I missed having something on a bench that would tell me the truth if I asked it correctly. My grandmother rang once. She asked if I was eating. Neither of us mentioned the bureau. It was the shortest conversation we have ever had. Sutton did not ring. He sent a message on the 14th of April offering me freelance restoration work. Subcontracted, unnamed, paid in cash. I read it 4 times to be sure I understood the shape of it. He was offering me my own hands back on the condition that they stayed anonymous. I did not reply, not out of pride. I simply had nothing to say that would survive being written down. On the 22nd of April, I took a walk that I had been taking most evenings, along the canal, past the yards where furniture used to be made when this was a furniture city. There was a broken chair by the towpath. Somebody had put it out with the bins. A country chair, elm seat, ash spindles, nothing valuable, missing a leg. I picked it up because I am the sort of person who picks those up. And when my hand closed on the seat, something happened that I have never been able to explain to a skeptic. A pale gray panel unfolded in the air above my wrist. Not gold, not triumphant. Gray, thin, and entirely silent, like a label on a museum case. It said the seat was elm, cut within 30 miles of where I was standing, in the 1860s, by a workshop that had employed 4 men and closed in 1881. It said the leg had been replaced twice. It said the second repair was done by a woman named Alice Verrill in 1934. Then it said the thing that mattered in the same flat gray lettering. It said, "No false claim recorded against this object." I stood on that towpath holding a broken chair for a long time, and I understood, before I understood anything else, exactly what I was going to do with the rest of my life. I have called it the Provenance System since that night because that is what it does. It does not value. It does not judge. It shows origin. Every object I touch, it reads where the material came from, whose hands shaped it, every alteration afterward, in order with dates. And last, whether anyone has ever recorded a false claim about it. Who made that claim, and in whose hand it was written. Took me 2 more weeks to find the limit, and the limit is the whole reason this story ends the way it does. The system shows me. It does not show anybody else. Nothing it tells me is admissible anywhere, and nothing it tells me can be repeated to a panel. What it does is point. It tells me exactly where in the physical world a piece of paper exists that says the same thing, and then it is my job to go and get that paper. A system that hands you the answer makes you a fraud with better luck. A system that hands you the location of the answer makes you an investigator. So I went and got the paper. That is the entire method. Took 9 months and it was extraordinarily boring, and I would recommend it to anyone. I started small because I had to eat. I set up a bench in the back of a house clearance yard belonging to a man who asked no questions about accreditation. £15 to tell a market trader whether a chest was worth restoring. 40 to write an honest 1-page condition note with no certificate attached. I could not certify. I said so on every single job in writing at the top of the page. I had learned what happens to people who are vague about what they are not. Word traveled the way it does in trades where nobody trusts a brochure. Within 4 months I had more work than bench. And every object I touched gave me its history, and I wrote none of that history down, because I could not corroborate it yet, and an uncorroborated truth is just a rumor with good posture. In August a man came to the yard looking for me specifically. He was in his 40s, cardigan, spectacles pushed up, and he introduced himself as an archivist. His name was Tomas Delgado, and he ran the county trade archive for rooms of ledgers that nobody had asked to see in 11 years. He had read a condition note I had written about a linen press. He said it was the first document he had seen in a decade that described what an object was rather than what it was worth. Then he said carefully that he knew who I was, and that he had followed the Ashfield matter, and that he did not believe I had signed that certificate. I asked him why not. He said because he had read my 4-page report, which had been entered into the public record as evidence against me, and it was the report of a man who did not sign things lightly. That was the first time in 7 months that anybody had reached the correct conclusion without me arguing for it. I found it harder to absorb than the hearing. Tomas gave me a reader's card. He also gave me, over the following weeks, an education in what a trade archive actually contains. Timber import manifests, workshop wage books, insurance schedules with itemized contents, auction house day books listing every lot and every consignor for 140 years. The system pointed. The archive answered. For the first time since March, I was doing something other than waiting. I want to be honest about my motive at this stage because it changed later, and the change is the point. In September, I was not trying to prove anything about my brother. I was trying to rebuild a body of work that could stand on its own without a certificate. The Ashfield Bureau was a closed matter, and I had accepted the 4 years. What changed it was a wardrobe in a house in Pellam Street, in October, belonging to a woman who wanted to know if it was worth insuring. It was a good wardrobe. Oak, mid-19th century, honest repairs. And when I put my hand on the door frame, the system said, "False claim recorded." Twice. It named a valuation certificate from 4 years earlier, attributing the wardrobe to a workshop it had no connection to, and inflating it by a factor of 9. And it named the hand that had written the claim. It gave me a name I had known my entire life. I sat down on the end of that woman's bed, which was unprofessional, and asked her whether she still had the paperwork from the last valuation. She did. People keep everything. That is the great secret of this work. She had it in a carrier bag with her late husband's war medals. The certificate was on Vance and Daughters letterhead. Carried my accreditation number. It was dated a fortnight before I had returned from 6 weeks in hospital with a broken wrist. I could not have written it. I could not have examined anything. My right hand had been in a cast for the whole of that month, and there were 4 medical letters to say so. That was the moment the shape of it arrived. The Ashfield Bureau was not an accident that a man had panicked and covered up. It was the one that had gone wrong. I went back to the archive and I asked Tomas a question that took him 3 days to answer. I asked how many certificates the firm had issued under my number. The board holds a copy of every certificate issued by an accredited authenticator. It is a public register. Nobody had ever thought to count. 231 certificates carried my number over 9 years. I had written 174 of them. 57 had been produced without my knowledge. I touched each of the 57 objects that I could physically reach over the following 11 weeks. 41 of them were correctly attributed. Sutton had been lazy, not indiscriminate. He had signed off the easy ones to save time and taken the fee. 16 were wrong. 16 objects in 16 houses and institutions carrying a document with my number on it that said something the object flatly contradicted. Of those 16, the system named Sutton's hand on 11, an unknown third party on 4, and on 1 it gave me a name I did not expect at all. The 11 were the point. 11 separate false claims in one hand over 6 years on a register that the board maintained and had never audited. Every one of them was corroborated by something outside my own head. A dated hospital letter, a shipping manifest, a wage book, an insurance schedule. That is what the system is for. It found 11 needles and then it stood back and let me spend 9 months proving that hay exists. I should describe what those 9 months actually involved, because people imagine a montage and it was not a montage. It was mostly trains and photocopies. A false claim on a piece of furniture is only provable if something else, written by somebody with no interest in the matter, contradicts it. That is the whole job. So for each of the 16 I wrote out what would have to exist for the certificate to be true, and then I went and looked for it, hoping to be wrong. That is a strange way to spend a year. I hoped to be wrong 16 times and I was wrong none of them, and there was no satisfaction in it whatsoever. The Yaxley chest took 11 weeks. The certificate said a named workshop in Bristol, in a year when that workshop's own wage book shows only 2 employees. 2 men cannot produce a piece with that quantity of carved work in a season. It is not an opinion. It is arithmetic, and arithmetic is very hard to cross-examine. The wage book was in a mill archive that opened on Wednesdays between 10 and 1. I went 4 times. The 4th time the box had been found in a different building. The Holbrook Mirror took 4 days, because the man who had made the frame had signed the back of it in pencil in 1912 and nobody had ever taken it off the wall. That is the pattern of this work. Some things take a season and some things take an afternoon, and you cannot tell which from the outside. There was one I had to abandon. A writing table in a private house where the system was completely clear and no corroborating document existed anywhere I could reach. I left it out of the report. It was the correct decision, and it is the one that still bothers me, because I know what that table is and I cannot say so. Tomas made me write a line at the front of my notebook and initial it. Nothing enters the report that a stranger could not verify without me. I annealed it. The 4 objects the system attributed to an unknown hand took the longest, because I had nothing to work from but the paper itself. All 4 certificates had the same defect. The maker's stamp in the accompanying photographs was too clean, and it sat a ½ millimeter off-center in exactly the same way. A stamp that repeats an error is not a stamp. It is a copy of a stamp. Somebody had cut a new die from a photograph, probably with a pantograph. Tomas found 3 restorers within 60 miles who had ever owned a pantograph. 2 had died. The 3rd was 91 and living in a bungalow in Fenwith. Percy Trewin had made replacement mounts and hardware for the trade for 50 years. He invited me in and showed me his workshop before I had explained why I was there. He was proud of the pantograph. He had cut dies for museums with it. He had also, he said, cut 4 maker's stamps for a dealer who told him they were for teaching replicas. He had written it in a job book because he wrote everything in a job book with the dates and the fee and who collected them. He had not been hiding anything. Nobody had ever asked. The dealer was not my brother. It was a man who had bought and resold 3 of the 4 objects, and who had needed a Vance and Daughters certificate to do it. Which raised a question I did not want the answer to, which was how an outside dealer had obtained certificates on our letterhead carrying my number. Percy asked me, when I was leaving, whether he was in trouble. I said no. I said he had kept better records than the firm that had employed me for 11 years. He laughed at that. Then he asked me to send him a copy of whatever I ended up writing, because he had never once been told how any of his work was used. I did send it to him. It is the only copy I posted without being asked to buy a lawyer or a board. Then there was the 16th, and the name I had not expected. A cabinet in a school hall in Martin, valued in 1979, attributed to a workshop it did not come from. The hand the system named was my grandmother's. Imelda Vance, 47 years old, at the height of her reputation, wrong by a century and a half. I stood in that hall for a long time. I had built a case on the principle that the register should say what is true. And here was the register saying something false in her hand. I want to be careful here because the difference matters. She had not lied. The system distinguishes a false claim from a false claim knowingly made, and hers was the first kind. In 1979, you could not photograph a saw mark and email it to a specialist in Copenhagen. She had done the best work available and it had been wrong. What she had done, though, was never revisited. And the cabinet had been insured on that valuation for 47 years. I could have left it out. Nobody would have known. It would have made the report cleaner and my case narrower and my family smaller. I put it in. Section 11, for pages, with the correction and the recommendation that the school's cover be adjusted. I did not soften a word of it. If the principle only applies to people you are prepared to lose, it is not a principle. It is a weapon with a nice name on it. Sutton came to see me in November. He found the yard, which cannot have been difficult, and he waited by the gate until I finished with a customer. He had brought a proposal. The firm would pay me a consultancy retainer, backdated 18 months, and support an early application to restore my accreditation. The figure was more than I had earned in any year of my life. And the condition, which he did not write down, was that I stop visiting houses. I asked him one question. I asked him to tell me, out loud, in the yard with nobody else there, how many certificates he had written under my number. He said that was not a helpful way to approach it. He said it 3 times in slightly different words, and then he stopped talking and looked at the gate. I have thought about that silence more than about anything he ever said to me. He was not deciding whether to confess. He was deciding whether I could prove it. I told him I was going to keep visiting houses. He folded the letter, put it back in his coat, and said that I had always been the one who made things difficult. 11 days later, I received a letter from the firm's solicitors. It ran to 3 pages and warned me against communicating with clients of Vance and Daughters. I sent it to Tomas, who read it and telephoned me and said, with some enjoyment, that they had just confirmed in writing which 16 clients they were worried about. They had not quite, but they had confirmed that somebody at the firm knew exactly where I had been, which meant somebody at the firm had been following the same trail backwards. So I made copies. 3 sets indexed identically, one with Tomas at the archive, one with a solicitor I paid £200 I did not have, one under my bench. That was not caution about my brother. It was caution about paper, which goes missing in ordinary ways, without anybody deciding that it should. I did not tell my grandmother any of it. Not the 16, not the 11, and not Section 11 either. I have been asked whether that was fair to her. It was not fair. It was necessary because she would have asked Sutton about it directly, and she would have believed his answer, and the trail would have gone cold in a week. Once, in December, she telephoned me and asked whether I was all right. I said I was working. She said, on what? I said, a wardrobe. That is the only time I lied to her. I have apologized for it since. She said that if I had told her in December she would have ruined it, and that she had spent 40 years being right about furniture and wrong about her sons. The last thing I needed was the software. Not the logs, which I did not know existed. the certificate templates which change every few years, in small ways nobody notices. The Ashfield certificate used a template that the firm had adopted in the March after it was supposedly issued. It was post-dated backwards onto the wrong stationery. Tomas found that. He compared 11 years of the firm's own certificates in the public register and built a table of which border style ran in which year. It took him 5 weekends, and it is 4 lines in my report. That is what an archivist is, and there are perhaps 200 of them left in this country. Eventually, I reached the end of what I could find on my own. 16 objects, 38 data documents, 1 job book, 1 insurance schedule, 4 medical letters, and a table of border styles. I have told this so far as though I were the only person looking into it, and that is not true. From about the August of that year there was a second investigation running alongside mine, and for 2 months I did not know it existed, and when I found out it was because it arrived at my door. Beatrix Lorne had been paid out by her insurers in the June. $406,000, less the policy excess, on a claim for a misdescribed purchase. Insurers do not simply absorb a figure like that. They pay it, and then they go and find out who ought to have paid it instead. The technical word is subrogation. The insurer steps into the shoes of the person it has paid and pursues whoever caused the loss. It is not a moral process. It is a recovery process, and it is extremely well funded, which morality generally is not. They appointed a forensic loss adjuster named Yaxley. I want to describe him accurately, because for a long time I thought of him as the antagonist of this part of my life, and he was nothing of the kind. He was the first person in 8 months to take the matter seriously in writing. His letter reached me in the October. 2 paragraphs. It said he was investigating the circumstances of a certificate issued under my accreditation number and invited me to an interview at a solicitor's office in Leeds. And it noted that I was entitled to bring representation. I read the phrase entitled to bring representation 4 times. It is the sort of sentence that changes the temperature of a room you are alone in. My solicitor, the one who had given me the honest hour, told me not to go. She said I had no obligation, that anything I said would be recorded and could be passed to the police, and that a man in my position who talks to an insurer is a man doing the insurer's job at his own expense. Tomas told me not to go either, which surprised me. He said archives teach you that the people asking questions rarely write down the answer you actually gave. He offered to come and sit in the corridor. I said that was not necessary. He came and sat in the corridor. I went because I had spent 8 months being unable to make anybody look at the documents, and here was a man whose entire profession was looking at documents. I have never regretted it. It was also, by a distance, the worst afternoon of the whole affair. The room had a table, 4 chairs, and a recording device the size of a paperback. Yaxley explained that the interview was voluntary, that it was being recorded, and that the file might in due course be passed to the police. Then he asked me to confirm my accreditation number, which I did. The first hour was chronology. Dates, the consignment, the bench work, the report, the sale. He did not interrupt once. He wrote continuously in a hardback notebook, in a hand so small it looked printed. The second hour was different. He turned a page and said that he wanted to put a theory to me, and that I should understand it was not an accusation but a possibility he was required to eliminate. Then he laid out, in about 4 minutes, the best case against me that anyone has ever made. It went like this. A man authenticates a piece he knows is wrong. He writes a private report expressing doubt, which he never escalates to the board or the consignor, and which sits in a drawer. The sale completes. He is paid through his salary from the commission. When the buyer's own consultant catches it 8 months later, the man produces the report he wrote and says, "Look, I always doubted it. The report is not a warning. It is an alibi written in advance by a man who knew there would one day be something to alibi." I want to be honest about my reaction, because the honest version is not flattering. My first thought was not that it was untrue. My first thought was that it was extremely good, and that if somebody had described that pattern of behavior to me about a stranger, I would have believed it. A well-built false account is not stupid. That is the entire problem with them. Everybody imagines they would recognize a lie about themselves, and the truth is that a good one is made of your own real actions in a different order. So I answered it properly. I said the report was dated the 18th and sent by email the same evening, that the sale completed on the 2nd of March, and that an alibi written a fortnight before the event it excuses is not an alibi, it is a warning that was ignored. He asked whether I could evidence the sending. I said the firm held the server record and had refused to release it. He wrote that down. Then he said, without any change in tone, that he could compel it, and he did 11 days later, and that is how my email came into existence as a fact rather than a claim. That is what I meant much earlier when I said the email did not save my accreditation. A document only becomes evidence when somebody with the power to demand it goes and demands it. For 8 months no such person existed. Then one did, and he was not on my side, and it made no difference at all. Then he asked the question I had been dreading since the letter arrived. He said, "Mr. Vance, you have referred 4 times this afternoon to other certificates. How many other objects do you believe are affected, and how are you locating them?" I had rehearsed this in the car, and every version had sounded like a man asking to be disbelieved. I could not say that an interface only I can see appears above my wrist when I touch a piece of furniture. There is no sentence in English that survives being said in a recorded interview. So I said that I had authenticated for 11 years in one county, that I remembered the objects, and that I was visiting them and examining them properly. Every word of that was true. It was also not the answer to his question, and we both knew it. He looked at me for a moment and then wrote something short. I have since seen his file. What he wrote was, "Withholding method, not content. Findings so far accurate," which is, I think, the most generous thing anybody wrote about me that year. At the end he asked whether I would provide him with everything I had gathered. My solicitor had told me twice in writing not to. Tomas was sitting in the corridor and would have told me not to. I gave him all of it that afternoon. People ask why. The reason is not noble. It is that I had spent 8 months trying to get a competent person to examine what I had found, and a competent person was sitting in front of me, and the fact that he was hoping it would incriminate me was irrelevant to whether he could read. If the work was sound, it would survive a hostile reader. If it was not sound, I needed to know before I built another 9 months on top of it. Handing your case to the person trying to break it is either the most reckless thing you can do or the only real test there is. Then he went quiet for 9 weeks and I heard nothing at all. The 9 weeks were not empty. In the November, the firm's basement store flooded. A feed pipe to the finishing room failed overnight and about 4 inches of water stood across the floor until the Monday. What was on that floor, in cardboard on the lowest shelf, was the firm's own duplicate set of certificates for the years before the system went electronic. 9 years of paper. It was pulped and it was dried out by a restoration company, and about a third of it was legible afterwards. I want to be careful here because this is the point in an account like this where the teller usually reaches for an accusation. I have no evidence that anybody caused that. Buildings flood. Feet pipes file. The firm had been told about that pipe by a plumber 2 years earlier and had not acted, which is ordinary and true and is probably the whole story. What I will say is that the board's public register held a copy of everything, that Tomas had told me in July to build a shadow set, and that on the day the basement flooded there were 3 complete index copies of the relevant material in 3 separate buildings, none of them ours. Caution about paper is not paranoia. Paper is destroyed constantly by damp and mice and skips and well-meaning office reorganizations, and almost none of it is destroyed on purpose. That is exactly why you copy it. The other thing that happened in those 9 weeks was that I ran into the limit of what I had been relying on, and I should set that out plainly because I have made the system sound more useful than it is. It requires contact. Not proximity, not a photograph, not a catalog entry. My hand on the object. In 11 years of this I have never once had it work through a pane of glass, and I have tried, in a museum, feeling ridiculous. Object 14 was a games table sold in the 2nd year, and by the time I got to it, it was in a sealed institutional store in a building with a signing-in desk, a curator and a policy about handling that existed for entirely good reasons. I wrote to them 3 times. The 3rd letter was answered by a curator who explained, politely and correctly, that access to the store required either a research affiliation or an accreditation, and that mine had been withdrawn, which she was sorry about and could do nothing regarding. So the system told me nothing about Object 14 ever. Not one word. And Object 14 is in my report, correctly identified as a false attribution, because Percy Trewin's job book listed the stamp he had cut for it, with a date and a fee and the name of the man who collected it. That is the shape of the whole thing. The ability that felt like a miracle in a stairwell was, in the end, a way of deciding which archive to sit in. Every single finding in that report is provable by somebody who has never touched anything. In the December, while I was still waiting to hear from Yaxley, Sutton made a proposal to my grandmother. A restructure. The firm would take outside investment, her holding would convert to a smaller share with an income, and the trading name would be licensed rather than owned. It was not a swindle. It was a genuine proposal from a genuine investor, and it would have kept 9 people in work, and it would also have placed the name Vance and Daughters and every certificate ever issued under it, beyond the reach of anybody who might later want to examine them. She asked for a week. On the 4th day of that week she fell in the workshop between the finishing room and the stairs and broke her hip, and was in hospital for 11 days and in a rehabilitation unit for 5 weeks after that. I sat with her on the 2nd afternoon. We did not discuss the firm or Sutton or the certificate or my accreditation. She asked about the yard. I described a linen press I was repairing and the state of its hinges, and she corrected my approach to the hinges, and she was right. She did not sign the restructure. She has never said whether the fall was the reason, and I have never asked because there is a class of question that has no answer that improves anything. That was the week I came closest to stopping. I had a folder in a stranger's office, a flooded basement, a store I could not enter, a grandmother in a rehabilitation unit, and a retainer offer in my coat pocket that would have paid for all of it. I took the offer letter out and read it twice and put it back. Not because I am principled. Because I worked out that if I signed it, the 16 owners would keep their false certificates, and I would spend the rest of my life being the only person who knew, which is a worse sentence than the one I was already serving. Yaxley's letter came on the 8th of January. 1 page. He wrote that he had completed his inquiries into my involvement and that the insurer would not be pursuing recovery against me personally, and that he considered my findings to be substantially reliable. Then a second paragraph which he did not have to write. He said he had spent 9 weeks attempting to falsify my findings, that he had independently re-examined 7 of the 16 objects with his own instructed expert, and that all 7 had come back as I had described them. He also wrote one sentence that I have thought about more than anything else in this story. He wrote, "I do not know how you identified these objects and you have declined to tell me, and having tested the results I have concluded that the question is no longer material." That is a professional saying. I checked, and it holds, so I am putting my discomfort down. It is a rarer thing than courage, and it is the reason there is an ending to this story rather than a man in a yard with a folder. So by the 2nd week of January I had 16 objects, an insurer's investigator on the record, a compelled email, a job book, an archivist's table of border styles, and a grandmother who had refused to sign away the name. And I had a decision to make about what any of it was for, which took me longer than the evidence had. Because there were 2 things I could do with it, and only one of them was justice, and I did not initially want that one. I could publish it, send it to a trade paper, to the 2 collectors' forums, to the local press. It would have finished him inside a month, and I would have felt magnificent for about a week. It would also have put 16 innocent owners' possessions in a newspaper, collapsed a firm employing 9 people, and put my grandmother's name in a headline beside the word fraud. And it would have made me the author of the punishment, which is the one thing my father told me never to be. Find out what a thing is. Write it down. Hand it to someone whose job it is. So I did the slow thing instead. In January I wrote it up. Not 4 pages this time. 206, indexed, with a document reference against every assertion and no assertion that rested on my word alone. And then I did the thing that people find least satisfying about this story, which is that I did not send it to the board. I sent it to Beatrix Lorne because she was the person who had actually been robbed, and because a man who has been wronged should not be the one who decides the punishment. Beatrix Lorne did not reply for 19 days. Then her assistant telephoned and offered me 20 minutes on a Tuesday morning, which I understood to be a test. Her study had 1 chair for visitors and no clock in view. I have thought since that both of those were deliberate. She had read all 206 pages. She had annotated 40 of them. She began by asking me why I had sent it to her instead of the board. I said because the board had already decided once on incomplete information and would be reluctant to look foolish twice, and because she had standing and I no longer did. She said that was the correct answer and that she had been prepared to end the meeting if I had said anything about justice. Then she asked the question I had been dreading, which was how I had known where to look. 16 objects across a region without access to the firm's files. I told her the truth, which was that I had touched them. I said I had a way of knowing which objects had been lied about, and that it was not evidence and never would be. She looked at me for a while. Then she said that she did not require an explanation of instinct from a man whose written corroboration was the most thorough she had ever received. I have thought about that answer a great deal. She had decided that where the questions came from mattered less than whether the answers held. Almost nobody is that disciplined. She commissioned an independent review at her own expense. 3 assessors, none of them from our county, none of them known to my grandmother or my brother. They were given the 16 objects, the 206 pages, and no explanation of who I was until after they had finished. That last condition was hers. She said a finding that survived not knowing whose side it helped was worth 4 times one that did not. The review took 11 weeks. I was not permitted to attend any part of it and I did not ask to. I kept working, 15 pounds a chest. I restored a linen press for a woman who paid me in installments over 4 months and apologized every time. Tomas came out to the yard on Fridays with photocopies and a thermos and we sat on upturned crates and argued about 18th century timber tariffs. The review itself was sealed and blind and I could not have influenced it if I had wanted to. What was not sealed was everything happening around it, and those 11 weeks were the only stretch of the whole affair in which I was actively fought rather than simply ignored. In the February, a trade journal carried 400 words under the heading Questions Raised over Yorkshire Authentication House. It named the firm once. It named no individual at all, which is what made it effective. If you already knew the story, the piece read as an account of a firm dealing with a dishonest employee. If you did not know the story, it read as a warning to avoid all of us. The only person in that trade who had been publicly named in the past year was me. Cost me 3 jobs inside a fortnight. A church that wanted 2 pews stabilized, a solicitor's office with a partner's table, and a woman in Ripon who telephoned to cancel and then telephoned again, an hour later to apologize for canceling and canceled. My income that month was £210. I mention the figure because accounts like this one usually skip the part where being right is not yet worth anything, and that part is most of it. The argument being made about me in that period had one moving part, and it was a good one. It was that I was not conducting an investigation. I was conducting a campaign against my own family, and a man who does that will find whatever he needs to find. In the March they found the strongest possible support for that argument, and I had handed it to them myself in writing for months earlier. They found Section 11. Sutton's solicitor wrote to the board pointing out that my report accused not only my brother but the firm's 81-year-old founder, and asked whether a document of that character could be described as a professional finding rather than a grievance. It is a genuinely strong point and I want to give it its full weight. From the outside, a man who has lost everything producing a document that indicts his entire family looks exactly like a man who has stopped being able to tell the difference between a wrong and a wound. Ines Barros wrote to me and asked me to respond to that letter within 14 days. Her request was 2 sentences long and gave nothing away, and I have since learned that she had already formed a view and was obliged to ask anyway. I wrote 3 drafts. The first was 4 pages and explained my motives. The second was 2 pages and explained my method. The third was 11 lines and explained neither. It said, "The 1979 certificate is factually incorrect. The correction is set out at Section 11 with its supporting references, and if the board considers that finding unreliable, it should test the references rather than the author." I signed it and sent it and heard nothing for 9 days. The second challenge was more serious because it went to the only thing I actually had. Sutton's solicitor argued that the medical letters proved my wrist had been in a cast, and nothing more. A man with one working hand can still dictate. A man in hospital can still approve a document by telephone. That is a real argument. It is the argument I would have made in their position. It would have been fatal to me if the Pellam Street certificate had carried only a signature. It did not. Along the lower margin, in ink, Somebody had written a 2-line note about the wardrobe's cornice and the replacement of its lock plate. Nobody dictates a marginal note about a lock plate. You write it because you are standing in front of the object. Beatrix Lorne paid for a document examiner out of her own pocket, without telling me, and instructed her through a solicitor so that the instruction could not be described as mine. The examiner's conclusion was properly cautious, which is why it was worth anything. She reported that the annotation was not written by me, and that its features were consistent with the comparison samples provided from my brother, at the level she described as strong support. I have reservations about handwriting evidence, and I said so at the time, which people found strange. It is a discipline with real limits, and I did not want a finding of mine resting on it. So we did not rest on it. It sat in the file as one line among 40. The thing that actually ended the campaign was 1 page long, and I had no part in it and did not know it was coming. On the 11th of March, my grandmother wrote to the accreditation board. She did it from a chair in a rehabilitation unit with a book on her knee for a writing surface. Tomas told me about it 3 weeks later. She has never mentioned it to me directly. She wrote that in 1979 she had certified a cabinet at Marden as the work of a workshop it did not come from, that the error was hers and nobody else's, that it had gone uncorrected for 47 years because she had never gone back to it, and that she had read Section 11 and found it accurate. The last line said that a register which cannot record its founder's mistakes is not a register. It is an advertisement. That single page removed the vendetta argument completely, because you cannot describe a finding as a grievance against a family when the head of the family has written in to confirm it and has taken the worst of it on herself in public. It also cost her something that I do not think anyone outside our trade would understand. She had been certifying objects for 54 years, and her name meant a specific thing to about 600 people, and she spent a measurable part of it on a cabinet in a school hall in Marden. I drove over that weekend. She was in a chair with her leg out in front of her, and she asked me whether I had sorted out the hinges on the linen press. I said I had. She said good, and asked what I had used and disapproved of my answer. We did not discuss the letter, then or since. There are families in which everything is said, and there are families in which things are done instead, and mine has never once managed both at the same time. After that it went quiet. The trade journal published nothing further. The solicitor's letters stopped in the first week of April. 2 of my 3 cancelled jobs came back without any conversation about why they had gone. And on the 22nd of April, 11 weeks to the day after it began, the Independent Review reported. It confirmed 16 false attributions, upheld every document reference in my report, and found no basis whatsoever for the finding against me. It also found something I had not because they had powers I did not. They obtained the firm's own certificate generation logs from the software provider. Every certificate in that system recorded which user account had created it and at what hour. Nobody at the firm had ever known that, including the man using it. The Ashfield certificate had been created at 11 minutes past 10 at night on the 22nd of February, from Sutton's account, at a terminal in his office. My report had never claimed that. I had not had access to it. The system had told me the hand, and the archive had told me the dates, and the software log told the rest without being asked. Ines Barros reopened the matter on the 4th of May. She wrote to me herself, which she was not required to do. Her letter was 4 sentences long. It said the board had erred, that a rehearing was scheduled, and that my accreditation was reinstated with immediate effect pending it. The 4th sentence said that she had chaired the original panel, and that she considered the error hers rather than the institution's. I have kept that letter. Not for the reinstatement, for the 4th sentence. Sutton was invited to respond to the review's findings. He engaged a solicitor and submitted 11 pages arguing that the software logs were unreliable. It was not a bad argument. Software logs can be wrong. The difficulty was that his 11 pages had to explain 16 objects, and they only addressed one. The rehearing was on the 19th of June in the same room with the same panel and a different number of people looking at me. I gave evidence for 2 hours and 11 minutes. I did not once say the word betrayal, because it is not a finding and a panel cannot act on it. I said, this object is oak, the certificate says walnut, here is the timber manifest, here is the log entry, here is the hospital letter. 16 times. The most effective thing about documents is that they are boring. Nobody can be talked out of a shipping manifest at 11 in the morning. Sutton gave evidence after me. I had expected him to be smooth. He was, for about 40 minutes. What undid him was not a dramatic question. It was Ines Barros asking him, in an almost apologetic tone, to walk the panel through the night of the 22nd of February. He said he had been at home. The log said his terminal. He said perhaps someone had used his account. He was asked who. He said he did not know. He was asked whether he had ever created a certificate under my number. There was a pause of perhaps 4 seconds, which in a hearing room is an extremely long time. Then he said that he had, on occasions, completed paperwork that I had been too slow to finish, and that he had regarded it as administrative. That sentence ended it. Not because it was a confession of fraud. Because it was a confession that the passive voice he had used for 16 months had a subject after all. My grandmother was in the room. She had come without telling either of us. She sat in the 3rd row in the same dark dress she wears to funerals. I did not look at her while I gave evidence. I could not have got through it, and she would have known that, and she would not have thanked me for it. Afterward she was waiting in the corridor. She did not apologize, and I am glad, because an apology would have been a smaller thing than what she actually said. She said, "I chose the account that let me keep believing the firm was well run." She said, "That was a choice about me, not about you." Then she asked if I would come back. I said not to the front of the house. She said she had not been offering the front of the house. She said the workshop had been standing empty for 14 months. The board's determination came in July. My record was cleared and the finding expunged, which is a stronger remedy than reinstatement and much rarer. Sutton's accreditation was refused, which is not the same as withdrawn, because he had never held one. He had been signing under mine for 6 years. The matter was referred to the police. I was interviewed twice and I answered every question, and I did not embellish a single one of them. He was not imprisoned. He was prosecuted, pleaded to 2 counts, and received a suspended sentence and an order to repay a figure that will take him most of his working life. People ask whether that is enough. I have stopped answering because the question assumes I was owed a quantity of suffering, and I was owed a corrected record. Beatrix Lorne was repaid in full by the firm's insurers. She kept the bureau. She had it recatalogued honestly as an 18th century bureau of unknown workshop, later altered. She said it was a better object with a true label than it had ever been with a false one, and that she had paid for the label, not the wood. I went back to Vance and Daughters in September into the workshop, on the condition that certificates issued under my number are created by me and logged in my own account. Tomas comes in on Thursdays now as our archivist, which is a post that did not exist and should have existed for 40 years. My grandmother still comes in on Tuesdays. She sits at the end of my bench and tells me which repairs my great-grandfather would have refused to do. The system is still there. It is quieter now, which I think is because there is less being lied about within reach of my hands. It still says the same last line on almost everything I touch, and it is the only line I ever wanted. No false claim recorded against this object. I did not take the firm from my brother. I did not need to. I only ever needed the register to say what was true, and a register is a patient thing. The chair from the towpath is in the corner of my workshop. I replaced the leg properly. I did not certify it because there is nothing to certify. It is just a chair that 4 men made near here in the 1860s, that Alice Verrill mended in 1934, and that nobody has ever told a lie about. That is the whole of what I do now. I find out what a thing is and I write it down and I put my name on it. It is not a spectacular way to spend a life. It is simply the only version of this work that I was ever any good at. My father used to say that a name is only a claim until somebody checks it. He was talking about furniture. I have decided he was talking about people as well.